Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and today we are going to talk about Alzheimer's and dementia. So I'm going to start by talking about my own experience with these diseases. And they're unfortunate, they're ugly, but they're a part of life. So my grandma on my mom's side was diagnosed with early onset. It was either dementia or Alzheimer's, but she was diagnosed early onset. And I believe it was by the time she was in her 60s. So she had it in her 60s, which is pretty early.
That's pretty early. Yeah.
Yeah, that's early.
It was probably the early onset Alzheimer's. I mean, that is clearly a diagnosis.
Okay. Right. So it was hell for my whole family. I was 13 at the time. And so
hell when she got the diagnosis or after?
Around that time. I was 13. I just remember being 13 years old, and she had come to stay with us, and she called me the B word and accused me of stealing her teddy bear.
Okay. That feels more like Alzheimer's.
Okay, right. And this was devastating to me as a 13-year-old because I couldn't understand why my grandma, who loves me, would say such things. And my mom had to explain to me that it's not her talking. She is sick. She's ill. And in her mind, she was connecting random things. And so it got to a point where she had to be put in a home because she was overdosing on her medication because she would forget she took it and take it again. And there's no cure for it. And so it ultimately ended the way all life does. But it can be a very, very difficult situation to deal with. So we're going to talk about the differences between Alzheimer's and dementia. We're going to talk about early symptoms and self-care and how to handle it when you're dealing with it.
Right. And so the first thing I want to say is that I'm not a medical doctor, and this is really much more of a medical topic. And
yes,
but although there are certainly psychologists who are involved in the treatment of people with dementia and Alzheimer's, but it's a real specialty. And it's probably a neuropsychologist. I was just thinking there's at least in Salt Lake City, Bob Hill, who was, he's in independent practice now, but he was one of my instructors when I was going through the graduate program. And he made a specialty. I mean, his specialty in research was Alzheimer's. And I'll talk about some of the things that he came up with. It was more in the treatment of Alzheimer's. So there certainly are psychologists who will focus on that. But, you know, for someone like me who has a practice who's dealing mostly with relationships, anxiety, depression, I would never treat someone for that. I would always refer them to someone else. You know, you talked about how devastating it is. I don't know if you've heard this term. Some people call it the long goodbye, because if you think about what makes you you, and one of the things that really makes you you, it's fundamental, is our memory and our experience. You know, there are many times in these podcasts, and even when you and I are talking, you know, before the podcast, where we're talking about childhood stuff, memories from, you know, and that's all memory. So what would it be like? Can you try and imagine if that slowly went away? And it just, I mean, it's almost like this dark cloud comes over your memory and starts to obscure it. I mean, it's hard for everyone. It's certainly hard for the person who has Alzheimer's, and it's very, very tough. Like you gave the example of your grandmother, because there are personality changes with Alzheimer's, and that's what's going on. And often there's inappropriate things that they say or inappropriate behaviors. But, you know, as a 13, 14-year-old, that's still hard to understand.
It was very, very hard. And I remember as it had progressed and she was in basically a hospice situation, you know, because my mom would call her as much as she could. And she put me on the phone one time, and the nurse says, "Say hi to your daughter, Sylvia." and she goes, "Hi, Sylvia." And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, so I mean, I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to handle this,
Yeah.
and so
It's
it's,
very hard. It's hard for adults to know how to handle, let alone an adolescent like you.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And, and not that my mom was trying to put me in a difficult situation. She
Oh,
just,
no, I don't think
you
so. She
know,
was probably just trying to give some sort of connection. But
yeah, she absolutely was. And I had really fond memories of my grandma. In fact, my grandma is the reason why for a long time I liked the smell of cigarette smoke.
oh,
Be-
you
because
associated that with her.
I did, because she smoked, and as a very young kid, I would be around her and I had happy memories, and it was an association thing,
Hmm.
and so for a long, long time, I liked this. Not that I wanted to, I would actively go seek it out to inhale it, because it's secondhand smoke isn't good for you. But I liked the smell. When I did catch a whiff, I liked it.
Yeah, isn't that interesting how smells do that? For me, it's lilacs.
Yeah.
When I walked to school in elementary school, it was always lilacs. And so in the
Hmm.
spring, I think I associated it with the end of school because it always happened
Yeah.
right before the end
Yeah.
of
And
school.
and again, it's what makes us who we are,
Yeah.
our memories.
So if you lost that, and for yourself and the people around you, that's really devastating because
It really
you
is.
essentially become a living ghost. I think is
Hmm.
that, there's nothing there.
Hmm.
Anyway, so let's talk about the difference. What are the differences between dementia and Alzheimer's? And so dementia is more of a category, or a lot of people call it a syndrome. And all a syndrome is a collection of symptoms that occur together often. So if you think of dementia as there are issues with memory, with
Hmm.
cognitive processing, social abilities, and they're severe enough, though, that they affect your daily life. And so underneath that would be Alzheimer's, and Alzheimer's is considered a dementia. But
Okay.
whereas dementia would not be considered a disease,
Okay.
Alzheimer's is definitely considered a disease. And I think the big difference is that, so if you think of dementia, there are certainly other diseases that cause someone to have dementia or those memory
Okay.
problems. But Alzheimer's is a disease in and of itself. And just briefly talking about what is it that goes on in the brain of someone who's got Alzheimer's. And so there are proteins in the brain. I'll try and make this really simple. There are proteins in the brain. There are
Yes.
two. One's called amyloid beta, and the other one is tau. And often, when they accumulate in your brain has a really good way of getting rid of them, or getting them out of the brain. And what happens in Alzheimer's is that whatever makes that process work
Hmm.
breaks down, and you start to accumulate, especially that amyloid beta. And so you may have heard the term, people listening may have heard the term plaques and tangles, which is kind
Okay.
of the way they describe what happens when there's the accumulation of these proteins.
Hmm.
And so what happens in the brain is that, I'm sure a physician would not describe it this way. I like to think of it as it gums everything up and it makes
Yeah.
it really hard. And I think in a real way, it destroys the neurons. And so that's how, it slowly disappears. The other thing, dementia in and of itself is not fatal.
Okay.
Alzheimer's certainly is. I don't think you would say there's any cure for dementia. There certainly right now is not a cure for Alzheimer's. And
Hmm.
it progresses. I think statistically, the average time after diagnosis is about 8 to 10 years. How long did your grandmother live with this?
I don't remember, but it wasn't long. It progressed
Pretty
pretty
rapidly.
quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was within 5 years, 5 to
Okay.
8 years. It was pretty quick. Part of it too could be her lifestyle, and we're going to get into that later, but she lived a very,
Yeah.
very unhealthy
Smoking.
lifestyle.
Hmm.
Yep, and she smoked. Yeah, it's not good for that. So let's talk about the difference in symptoms, because Alzheimer's and dementia look very, very similar, and they can
Well,
often be hard to differentiate.
right. I think their symptoms are the same. And what makes them
Okay.
different is that Alzheimer's, it's fatal. And
Okay.
it's a disease that progresses. And so you bring up a really good point, is how does one diagnose this? And so
Hmm.
the first thing that you want to do, and I think this is mostly people who are around the person who might be getting dementia or Alzheimer's. And so here are some of the things to be aware of, or the symptoms.
Hmm. Yes.
So memory loss. And that's typically noticed by someone else. It's usually the person. We're not very good really at, being able to determine whether we all think we have better memories than we do,
Right.
but often it's the person that's around you that has trouble or that notices that you're having trouble with memory. But again, memory loss is common to dementias. So just because you have memory loss and you're aging doesn't mean you've got Alzheimer's at all. And we'll talk about how they diagnose that now. Difficulty in communicating or finding words. And a lot of older people have that, but again, doesn't necessarily mean you've got Alzheimer's, but it may be an indication of.
Right. Well, I have that sometimes too. It's an excess though, is what it comes down to, because everyone goes through that at some point. But
I think that's stress related. I think when we're stressed, and we might even know that we're stressed, but we have trouble finding those words. Difficulty with visual and spatial abilities.
Okay.
So like getting lost while driving. Also, one of the difficulties with dementia and Alzheimer's is they tend to wander. They'll leave, if they can, they'll leave the place, they'll wander, but they have no idea where they are. And there's a thought that they're actually, when they wander, they're actually trying to accomplish something. It's just we don't know what that is. So it's not that they walk out and just start wandering aimlessly. They probably in their mind have some idea of what it is they're after. But the problem is they don't have very good spatial abilities and they get lost. Difficulty in reasoning or problem solving, difficulty handling complex tasks. Like planning, organizing. Now, what that speaks to a lot is your frontal lobe and a deterioration of your ability in your frontal lobe, which that's where we call the executive functions reside. There can even be difficulty in coordination or motor functions. So walking, stumbling, balance, things like that, confusion and disorientation. Now, I think certainly with both dementia and Alzheimer's, maybe more so Alzheimer's, there are personality changes, which you mentioned. With your grandmother, which are really, they're disturbing for those people around it, because all of a sudden, the person is behaving in a very different way. Depression, anxiety, what we'd call inappropriate behavior. So calling your granddaughter the B word is, one would say it's inappropriate behavior. But often the inappropriate behavior, they might walk out without any pants on or something. And that for them, nothing's wrong with that. They may make inappropriate sexual advances to someone. Again, and what that speaks to is you're just losing your ability to make those executive functions and those decisions.
Right.
I mean, the more I talk about this, it's just so sad, that this happens. Really sad.
It really is. And it's heartbreaking. And one of the reasons why I like bringing awareness to it is because there's a strong genetic component.
That's right. That's right. So let me just finish. Paranoia, agitation, and hallucinations can also be part of that. So, how do you prevent this? I think more and more we're realizing that I think in most health issues, most mental health issues, there is probably some combination of environment and genetics. And it's really hard to tease that out, but there certainly is a genetic component to it. And so, that's terrible to say, you may have that in your genes, but I think the important thing is I believe there are things you can do to decrease either the severity or the date of onset, or, with dementia to hold off on making it very serious. And so I think that's what they're doing with Alzheimer's. And so if you think about how do they diagnose it, and then what do they do with it? There's a lot of research going on, and I'll be upfront. I'm not out there on the research. I don't know what's going on, but I do know that there are a lot of several pharmaceutical companies who are working on medications. And so there are some medications that once it's diagnosed, say with Alzheimer's, then you can take that and it tends to slow it down. Now, it used to be, like 15 years ago, people would say, well, you never can get a true diagnosis of Alzheimer's until the person dies and you cut open the brain and look at it. And that's not true anymore. So they have what they call biomarkers. And so the biomarkers, one of the great things about technology is you can do an MRI. The other one I think that's done is called a PET or a PET. I don't know what that stands for, but they're both imaging
the
techniques.
PET scan.
Yeah, a PET scan, ways to look at the brain. And so you can look inside and you can determine if you have those plaques or tangles. You know, someone who's really experienced that can see it. And so to be able to confirm that diagnosis. I think the other thing, and this I've always thought is a little risky, is you can do a spinal tap and take some spinal fluid out and test that. But I don't know that that's done very often, just because I think it can be a little bit risky.
And it's probably more risky the older you are.
Right. A lot of things are.
Yeah. It's a pretty invasive medical procedure. And invasive medical procedures are certainly more risky to a 75-year-old versus a 25-year-old.
That's right. That's absolutely true. Whereas you can stick someone in an MRI and probably get a pretty good idea, but that's what they call the biomarkers. So I think it's easier to determine the diagnosis nowadays than say it was 15 years ago. So two things we want to talk about is what can we do for what I'd call the environment or cultural part. So you can't do anything about the genetics, at least not right now. That may change someday. But what can you do to make it less likely that it might be triggered or that it may be less severe? And so we're going to go back to some of the things we've talked about before, which is, I think the first one is good exercise. Although I think exercise and what you consume, so what you're eating, I would guess they're probably pretty equal in their importance in having that healthy lifestyle.
Yeah.
So the exercise is really critical because it makes for a healthy brain. I mean, it's what we've said in previous podcasts around anxiety and depression. And what we're really trying to do is to change the connections in the brain. So it has a positive effect on those neuronal connections. So that's one thing. Processed foods, we really know processed foods are not that good for us. And so what you're consuming is really important. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, fish. I think there are some supplements that I take fish oil or whatever, I think it just says fish oil on it because
the omega-3s.
There's a lot, the omega-3s, which you can get from fish, but I think mostly salmon. So you can go online and get recommendations about how to eat healthy. And I think one of the problems in our culture is we don't take time to really cook a meal from scratch because it's too easy to go buy something, open the mix, have a processed food. But I think if you really want to work for a healthy brain, so now we're talking about what makes a healthy brain. I think it's good exercise and what you eat.
Yes. And we're going to get into sleep next because that's equally important. And as you were talking about these proteins that build up in the brain and how your body gets rid of them, it made me think of the way that we need sleep to get rid of, I guess they kind of call it like gunk in the brain. And that sounded very much like that.
Yeah. And the reason we sleep, I think that even people who specialize in knowing what sleep is, I think it's still kind of a mystery of the reason we sleep. We do know that if you go without sleep, it's very bad for your body and your brain. And so there's some regenerative process that happens during good sleep, which is that's exactly what you're describing. And so, we are a nation that has big sleep difficulties. And I think it's lifestyle choices, it's the way we live, it's the anxiety, it's the stress that we have. A lot of us stay up too late. We are too much on our tablets. I mean, there are any number of things. And the exercise and what we eat certainly has a positive effect on how we sleep as well. In my initial intake for anyone, I will ask them what they're eating, and I'll specifically ask about caffeine and alcohol and drugs, how they sleep, how they exercise, because I want to have an idea of what it is, kind of the whole person, what's going on, not just whatever symptoms they bring in. This ties in a little bit to, I mentioned Bob Hill and some of the research he had, that throughout the lifespan, the brain is plastic, is what we call it, which means we can form those new connections. And here's one of the things they found that is really helpful for forming connections in older people: dancing.
Okay.
So you've got movement and you've got cognition because I don't know if you've ever danced. The only time I really danced is at my daughter's weddings, and I had to take dance classes. And it was hard. It was hard though, because you have to keep straight, what are the steps? Where am I? And then, you're with this partner who you're doing things. So dancing is really something that is good for your brain, because it involves all those things. Yeah. Now, the other thing, I'll just say what I do, because, I'm 65 and I don't know that I worry. I just want to be proactive. So I started memorizing poems.
Okay.
And I remember when I first did it a couple of years ago, it's almost like it felt like I woke up a part of my brain that hadn't been used. Because I work, I've been working for so many years, it's kind of just happens. And there's part of my brain that I don't use. So I just started memorizing poems. And the other thing that's really helpful is language. So every day I work on Spanish and French, and not necessarily that I want to go speak in France or Spain, but it's just really good exercise for your brain. So it's like, how do you exercise the brain? Now, there are a lot of apps out there, and I don't know how effective these are, that are really geared towards this. Like if you go on the internet, you'll find quite a few of them that they'll specifically say that what they're trying to do is exercise your brain and make it stronger. And I think what they're doing is they're working on those connections.
Yeah, I see ads all the time that say neurologists are begging people to play this game. And it's a word game. It's just a ploy. Right. But in a way, it probably is good. Or trying to see letters, find a pattern, and form a word.
Right. And so I think one of the worst things you can do as we age, I mean, you're far away from this. You have young kids, not retired yet. But as people hit retirement, the worst thing you can do is be sedentary and just sit in front of the TV. Yes. And so you need to keep your mind you need to keep your body and your mind active. And those people who do have, less chance of having that dementia. So I think that's everything that I wanted to say about how do you prevent it. It's being active and eating the right things and getting good sleep. Those are all the things that we talk about in previous podcasts. They're just generally good things for people to do.
Yeah, they really are. And something that if you have that genetic component, you need to do even more. And I certainly know I'm at risk for it because of my genetics. And and what you said about it decreases anxiety and depression. I noticed that I went out of town for 3 weeks. And during that 3 weeks, it was really busy. I was spending a lot of time with family and it was really great, but I wasn't exercising the way I normally do. And I got depressed. Yeah. And when I got back home, I got back into my routine and I started exercising again. I started to feel better. So
there's something about that blood flow to the brain. Is really, and the natural release of endorphins.
Yeah.
Is what happens. Yeah.
It becomes addictive. Once you can find something that you like in terms of exercise, whatever it may be. And I tried to exercise throughout my adult life and I never succeeded at doing it for longer than like a month regularly until I started biking. And I found out that I really like biking. And part of it too.
Like a stationary bike, or did you get out on the road?
I get out on the road.
Good for you. That's great.
Yeah, it is. And I really like it. And part of it is I live in a very flat state. And so
that makes it easier.
It really does. There's no hills. And biking up a hill, it's hard. I used to live in Utah. When I lived in Utah, I hated biking. Like I used an e-bike because I could get up the hills.
That's cheating, Liv.
It really was. But now I'm in this really flat state and I bike. Yeah, I bike and I love it. And I bike.
So I see a lot of bikers, and runners.
Please don't push me off my bike.
Oh, they put.
Talking about I was referencing the episode we had a while ago.
Yeah. I can't believe you remember that. Because I live up Immigration Canyon where there are a lot of bikers.
I
kind of had that thought this morning, but that's a different subject. Anyway,
don't push me off my bike if you ever see it.
But the bikers and the runners, I think I've never had one say that it doesn't give them that, like they talk about being in the zone. They talk about it being meditative in some ways. And then you're getting your heart rate up. It's very aerobic. I think it's one of the best things you can do. So
Well,
that's great.
And biking is also low impact
Mm-hmm.
too on your joints.
Right.
So,
And which is really important. Running is not. And so the bikers with the low impact, I'm all for biking, but that's great.
Yeah.
So how do you well, treatment? I don't know if we call it treatment. I think it's more care.
Yes.
How does one care? And I think that at some point, not always, but at some point, it becomes necessary to have professional care. And I think, as you said with your grandmother, eventually she went into a care facility. I do believe that, in the early stages, if they can be with family, that's certainly the best thing to do because it's familiar. And if you put them in a care facility too soon, then it just causes that increase in anxiety. But eventually what happens is, sadly, they really don't know where they are. And they would be confused and disoriented no matter where they are. So I think there are a lot of resources out there as far as caring for the person with dementia or Alzheimer's. And as I said, earlier, that it is really worth consulting a doctor for, a specialist, because then if you've got that diagnosis of Alzheimer's, then I think there are medications you can try that will slow up that that degenerative process. So that's the one thing to do, is don't be afraid of going to a doctor, and don't be afraid of really saying, I think we need to get this checked out, because you need to have the proper care. But I think one of the things that we don't think about often is, what about the caretakers? Because this can be incredibly taxing and draining. And so just before we started this podcast, I got online and I just wanted to see what are the resources for caretakers. And there are actually quite a few, and a lot of them are online support groups. But I would guess in most large cities, you would have an in-person support group. And I think, so the first thing is to get support, just to realize there are other people who are struggling with this same thing. And they also give you ideas, because everyone has different experiences, and what you're struggling with, the person in the support group may have dealt with that a couple of months ago, and they can say, here, try this. I think what you also need is what you call respite. And so you need to be able to get away. You need to be able to trust someone else to come in and be the caretaker. So if they're in your home, someone else to come in and be the caretaker, so that you can get away, because caretaker fatigue, is what we call it, is a real thing.
It really is.
And we wear out. And I think that if you don't take a break, then the risk is you yourself become so stressed that often you might get angry, you might lash out at the person you're caring for. Whereas if you can take care of yourself, I think it's so important to take care of yourself in these situations, because in the end, you provide better care.
Yes.
And so you really have to be able to take that time away.
Right. And I have heard so many horror stories of long-term healthcare facilities. They're often understaffed and underpaid. And I've always heard people say it really needs to be an absolute last resort. So
I would say that too. I agree with that.
Yeah. There does come a point, though, where is it more dangerous for them to stay in the home, particularly if there's medication involved? And the situation we ran into with my grandma, where she was double taking her medication, that can be incredibly dangerous too.
Right. But I think often at some point there become the actual physical task of taking care of an older person, lifting, things like that, bathing, dressing, because eventually they lose the ability to do that. And what I've heard are more the horror stories is they'll go and turn on the stove because it's something that they did 50 years ago, but that's it. And so they could either start a fire or leave the stove on. And so there really do become some safety considerations.
Yes.
But I agree with you. And I understand every person's situation, every family situation is different. But I would say if there's any way you can do it, that, keeping the person in your home or with you or caring for them in some way is the much better option for them.
Yes, I agree. And that's my goal because I've thought a lot about it, because I went through it with my grandma so young, and it's a concern I have with my mom. And we've talked about it. And I think that's really important to talk openly about it. And there was a point where she said, I don't want to be like my mom. I don't want to be a burden. Just put me in a home. And now as she's gotten older, she started to say, please don't let me be neglected in a home.
Yeah.
And if we do have to deal with this, and we're all optimistic that we don't, but I mean, reality is there's a chance.
Yes.
And so my goal is to have someone who is professionally trained to deal with someone who has Alzheimer's and dementia and can be an in-home healthcare worker.
Right. And Medicare, I know, has in-home healthcare as an option.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't take advantage of that.
My mom worked in Catholic Community Services for a number of years. And one of the things that they provide is in-home healthcare for the elderly. And my mom did that for a number of years. And for them, I think it's easier because they can better compartmentalize, because this isn't a loved one.
Right.
This is someone they will hopefully grow to care for and develop a bond with. But it's so much easier to distance yourself because it's work, not family.
Right. And so I think that if you have a loved one who, you get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or dementia, then I think one of the first things you do as a potential caretaker is be aware of all the resources in the community.
Yes.
And I think for most communities, for most large cities, this wouldn't be true for rural areas, but for most large cities, there are going to be quite a few resources. And so if you are aware of what they are, you aren't going to need them right off, but eventually you probably will. And so the important thing, don't go through this alone. Don't be the caretaker alone.
Yes.
You need to have support and ideas and respite, and don't do it alone.
Yeah, I agree. So this has been fantastic as always. And if you need help anyway, reach out to us. We would love to give you ideas and brainstorm if you do need some options.
Send us your questions. We love questions.
We do.
Yep.
We absolutely do love questions to answer. So next week, we're going to get into codependent relationships, which is
such a good topic. I love that topic.
Yes, because apparently it doesn't mean what we all think it means. So
I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding of what it means. So we'll cover that.
Yes, we're going to go into that next week. So we will see you all then.
Bye.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.